All right, well, my name is Emma Biggs, and I'm the Environmental Education Officer for South West Norfolk. This is the first of a number of talks that we've got planned on environmental issues. And I'm thrilled that for our first one, we've landed such a big fish. And we have the honour of being joined by Shlomo Dowen, who is the National Coordinator of UKWIN, the United Kingdom Without Incineration Network, who's generously given his time this evening to talk about an issue that will affect us all, no matter how far away we may live from the site, as he will explain. Our meeting includes people from a range of political positions. With the permission of the CLP, I've opened the meeting up to non-party members, because right now there are some issues that are extremely pressing that perhaps can be said to represent an existential threat to our survival. And this is one of them, as you will see. The campaigning group WISWIN, Beach Without Incineration, who coordinate the fight against the mega incinerator that's proposed locally, was itself inspired by Shlomo's site and organisation, and I'm pleased to say that quite a few members are with us this evening. Shlomo has many notches on his belt in terms of successful campaigns against incineration, and his website is a storehouse of information as to how to coordinate the fight. I suggest that you all have a look at the site at your leisure, which I'm sure he'll give you information about. For CLP members, I'll put up the information on our Facebook page. But now, over to Shlomo, who's going to give us a short presentation of about 15 minutes, followed by questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Emma, John, and Jim. What I'm going to attempt to do now is share the screen so that you can see the PowerPoint presentation. Of course, it worked perfectly earlier in rehearsal. Yeah, no, it seems to be happening here. Right, okay. So that's a photo of UKWIN members at a recent gathering in London. And just to give you some idea about UKWIN, we've got the UK incineration scene in numbers. There's only one national organisation that is the umbrella, if you like, infrastructure organisation for anti-incineration campaigning throughout the UK, which includes England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. There are currently some 40 odd incinerators that are operational and another 20 that are in various stages of construction throughout the UK. Over the past decade, UKWIN, together with its members, have actually managed to prevent more than 100 incinerators. So it can be done. Don't let anyone tell you that it's a done deal. Incinerators can be stopped. There are another 80 or so incinerators currently in the pipeline that are in various stages of seeking planning permission and or an environmental permit. Over the years, we've worked with more than 150 different anti-incineration groups, and we do so largely through voluntary efforts, and we keep our costs down to about £30,000 a year. So we invite donations and we seek grant funding and the rest. You should be able to see at the top there the URL, the web address of the UKWIN website, ukwin.org.uk. This isn't an actual interactive, this is just a screenshot. And obviously there's lots to click and explore, as Emma was kindly saying. Including a set of reasons very straightforward for why UKWIN opposes incineration, what can be done to run a local campaign, what the national campaign is up to, some fairly straightforward facts and figures, a bank of quotes, and then an interactive map and table of potential existing and prevented incinerators from throughout the UK. The UK not only supports individual anti-incineration groups, but we lobby at a national level, and we've had some successes over the years. We've had an early day motion that was signed by members of Parliament from all of the different political parties active at Westminster. We also do have supportive MPs in Sinn Féin, but they don't take part in early day motions. But these are the mugshots of 24 Labour MPs, just to bring home the point that it's something that is, if you like, a rising issue on the agenda of Labour MPs. But you don't have to be a Labour MP to oppose incineration. UKWIN directly and through our members are working with 60 different MPs from throughout the political spectrum. And as Emma was saying earlier, this is an issue that, if you like, attracts attention cross-party. The shadow business minister, Dr. Alan Whitehead, took part along with other MPs in 2 Westminster Hall debates at the beginning of the year. And this is just a representative quote of the sort of things that MPs were saying, but also Alan is the shadow Bays minister, so he's on the shadow cabinet. We must remember that the age of incinerators is over. A decade or 2 ago, perhaps we could have said that incineration was an improvement on the previous practice of landfill. However, as we move forward towards zero waste, we are in danger of freezing in time our waste strategies by granting permission for large incinerators that capture waste streams over time. That will prevent us from moving up the waste hierarchy and dealing with our waste generally, and in looking at it as a resource to be recycled, reused, and put back into the circular economy. Rather than put in landfill or buried, usually for minimal energy recovery, we are at a turning point. The future is zero. It cannot be incineration. We have to move rapidly up the waste hierarchy. And that captures a lot of the ideas and the energy of the anti-incineration arguments at the moment. I mentioned earlier the map and table. This is the entry. You can see in terms of interactive, I typed in Medworth, and this is what came up. The ones that are sort of orangey are actually links. So you can see for each existing, potential, and prevented incinerator in the UK, we provide information about where the location is, whether the status, in other words, this is a potential one, whoops. The location, the would-be operator, the campaign group, and a little bit of information about the current state of play. So you can see there how we're still in the pre-application stage. In order to follow the trajectory of this particular application, there are some important websites to touch base with from time to time, including the National Infrastructure Planning website, because although some planning applications for incinerators are decided at a local or at a county level, because this incinerator would be generating more than 50 megawatts of electricity, it counts as nationally significant infrastructure. And so the way it is decided is slightly different. And as you can see here, the application process is fully described on the National Infrastructure Planning website, so you can follow that process. And once again, you can see we are in the pre-application stage. And this gives you an idea that at the time I took this shot, there were only 5 entries, including one from Cambridgeshire County Council, which was actually quite encouraging. There was another document that was available, which was the PINS, which is the Planning Inspectorate Project Inception Meeting Note. And there were a number of things that jumped out at me that I wanted to deconstruct or decode about that note. So first of all, you can see the date. So you can see it was quite some time ago that this process began. And you can see how the applicant is being given lots of time to get their act together. And by stark contrast, we are, as consultees, are not always given lots of time to respond. So it is a frustrating, if you like, weighted situation, weighted in favor of the applicant. Then we see, and I'm just jumping around here, the applicant describing the facility as a power station. It is not a power station. A power station would be subject to the emissions trading scheme. So that means that the carbon dioxide emitted by a power station is covered in the carbon trading emissions scheme, whereas incinerators are not. And this is clearly an incinerator. They will have to get an environmental permit, and that environmental permit will describe the facility as an incinerator, not as a power station. Then it talks about how many tons it'll burn. I'll explain that in a moment. But it refers to the handling of non-recyclable waste. They talk about residual waste, and they talk about non-recyclable waste as if they were interchangeable. Well, residual waste is, if you like, from the word residue, it's what's left over after the recycling has been taken out. But that doesn't mean to say that what's left over cannot be recycled. And in fact, roughly 50 to 60% of what is in the so-called residual waste is readily recyclable. It's just whoever discarded it didn't put it in the recycle bin. Then, and there are various studies on the UKWIN website of local authority after local authority analyzing the content of the residual waste and identifying how much of it could have been recycled. Now, incinerators are not built on the basis of how many tons they can process. They're built on the basis of how much input they can handle in relation to the energy, the calorific value. So that's why there's a difference between roughly 500,000 and just over 600,000 tons of waste per annum, because it depends what that material is. If that material is largely plastic, then that material has a very high calorific value. Less of it can be fed in at any given time. If it's mostly vegetable matter, then it will have a low calorific value and more of it can be processed in any one time. When it talks about net electrical and gross electrical, the difference between the 58 and the 52 is 5 megawatts that would be required to power the plant itself. And then it talks about the possibility of exporting heat, but that's not confirmed, which means that they will describe it as CHP, or combined heat and power enabled, or CHP ready, in the same way that your drive is Ferrari ready. It means that your drive can handle a Ferrari parking on it. It doesn't mean to say that there's one there already. And there are many CHP ready facilities that are not connected to district heating schemes in the UK. In fact, only about 5 or 6 out of the 43 operational incinerators are hooked up to a district heating scheme in the UK. In other countries, in Northern Europe, where there's a demand for heat all year long, that percentage is, in some cases, 100%, all of them, but not in the UK. Then the reference is made to an air quality assessment. We'll look out for that. That will help determine the height of the chimney stack. And what they do is they play off, obviously, the higher the stack, the safer it is for local residents, the more that the pollutants are dispersed, but the more expensive it is. And so they play off the benefits for local residents against the cost. and at some point the cost of making it another meter higher, they decide is more than the payoff when it comes to protecting local health. It's proposed that a part of the electricity generated could be utilized by local industrial customers, with the remainder sold to the national grid. Don't be fooled. It'll all be, if the facility goes ahead, and we hope it doesn't, if the facility actually works, and if energy is generated, all of that energy will be sold. The industrial customers will not, as this implies, receive that electricity for free. Don't believe it. It's not yet clear if the electrical connection will form part of the development consent order. So ordinarily there are planning permissions, but in the case of this nationally significant infrastructure, there are development consent orders. And I understand that there may be land that would have to be commandeered for this project, and the landowner may not want that to happen. So that could get interesting. The stream can be utilized by industry. That doesn't mean it will. And then it refers to rainwater that will be used to quench the ash that remains after the combustion process. You may be surprised to learn that that could constitute between 25 and 30% of the original material that's fed into the incinerator. Some of that will be metal that can be recycled. Some of that will be brick and glass that were never combustible in the first place. And some of that ash will be potentially usable, and some of it is potentially hazardous. I think we can move on there. It just gives you some idea of what is being talked about by the Planning Inspectorate. And part of what they say in the scoping opinion, which is another document from the National Infrastructure Project website, is that the scoping report lacks in-depth detail. And so they're looking for more from the applicant. Scoping is the idea that what should fall within and what should fall outside of the scope of their environmental statement. By law, there has to be an environmental impact assessment, and that is known as an environmental statement. ES stands for environmental statement. And what they're saying is that the environmental statement should include references to climate change, including in relation to the nature and magnitude of greenhouse gas emissions from the proposed incinerator. And that's a vulnerable area because incinerators emit large quantities of greenhouse gases, and we're in theory moving towards a situation of net zero when it comes to carbon emissions by 2050. If this process falls into place fairly promptly, the incinerator could be up and running by 2025, but not necessarily. And it would certainly still be expected to be in operation for 2050 and even 2075, potentially. So from that point of view, the climate change impacts become very significant. The environmental statement should include an assessment of the effects on the conservation area and other relative heritage assets. So you may want to get in touch, if you're not in touch already, with English Heritage, with any conservation groups or organizations with responsibility for the conservation area, to ensure, well, to listen to what they have to say about the proposal and to see if they are actually going to oppose it. I can tell you this from past experience, whether it is making arguments about wildlife or making arguments about heritage, if the relevant bodies, whether it's the Wildlife Trust or whether it's a conservation group, if they are not objecting, then it's very difficult for the local group's objection, the local anti-incineration group's objection, to be treated with respect. So it is important to communicate with other stakeholders because they may be helpful. I promise you I'll not go through all of the words on this slide. The presentation will be made available to you, I'm sure, and you'll be able to read it in full. These are only excerpts from the submission made as part of the scoping opinion consultation by Cambridgeshire County Council. And they talk about the climate change issue. They talk about their Cambridge University Science and Policy Exchange document, which refers to the report, which is relevant to the project in that it talks about the carbon footprint. On it goes to talking about the government's resources and waste strategy. This is a good submission from Cambridgeshire County Council, and it's important to keep on them to apply political pressure to hopefully ensure that they maintain an objection to this proposal. Earlier, there were references made by Alan Whitehead and others to the circular economy. Here we have another example here talking about the circular economy principles. What is meant by that? Currently, our economy, or what's left of it, is primarily based on linear. I know that there are service industries that are very important, but a lot of stuff that is sold first is extracted, then it goes through a manufacturing process, and there's various transportation involved from one to the other. It is sold, it is used, and then it is discarded, where it's then, generally speaking, either incinerated or landfilled. That is, and then obviously that necessitates further extraction to make more goods. With a circular economy, we have an image that is taken from circulartayside.co.uk. So it is, in a sense, local government backed, and it shows the various loops that are that give the name circular economy its name circular. And you can see that incineration and landfill are described as leakages from the circular economy to be minimized. And the idea is that the UK has signed up to adopting the circular economy, and that is referred to in our current resources and waste strategy. And incineration, you could say, goes against that. And just a couple of finishing slides here. One, to give you a sense of the relative fossil carbon intensity of the energy from incinerators here at around 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, compared to combined cycle gas turbine of between 340 to 350 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Coal, which is demonized and which we celebrate being phased out, is 870 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. The incineration of the plastic component of the waste releases more greenhouse gases than the burning of coal, at more than 1 ton of CO2 for each ton of plastic. And there are certain types of plastic that are actually 2 tons of CO2 for each ton of plastic incinerated, because the carbon in the plastic combines with the oxygen in the air to create CO2. And then, so you can see how it's laughable to describe incineration as a low carbon source of energy. And then finally, the incineration at around 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour at the top is increasingly out of step with the national grid average, which has been reducing from a high of about 370 in 2010 to a current level of around 200 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So incineration is already 4 times that. And here, by the time we get to 2029, it is roughly 8 times the grid average, which takes into account energy generated from all sources, including wind and solar, etc. So that is my presentation. I make no apologies for it being technical, not least because there won't be an exam. I'm not expecting you to memorize this. It's to give you to convey a sense of the complexity of it, and to reassure you that there are no, shall we say, bad questions. So these are some of the questions that were circulated with the invitation, but I'll stop sharing those so that way we can just return to the view of all the people. And I suppose now is the opportunity, ideally, to put your name into the chat facility in order to indicate that you'd like to ask a question. So I'll mute myself because otherwise I'll just keep talking.